Wickedness and Redemption, the big boat story. All right. So, global hegemony, it turns out, has consequences. George Smith was a historian and translator in the British Museum, and in 1872, just as the British conquest of Persia had sent back to London a stack of cuneiform tablets. The French and the German had done seminal early work on this strangely written language, but it would be the British, and specifically Smith, who first discovered that ancient Sumerians had their own versions of Christian Bible stories. When Smith started translating Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, he was so amazed that he, quote, began to remove articles of his clothing and ran around the room, which is what you do as a Victorian gentleman in the British Museum. This is that exact Tablet 11. It is made of clay, and a scribe used a small reed with a sharpened end to press marks into the clay. The combination of marks made the world's first written syllabary of the Sumerian language, which was used afterwards to write many other languages as well. Now this tablet, Tablet 11, contains the story of Utnapishtim, a wise man who is warned by a god that there will soon be a flood that will kill all living creatures, and that he should make a very large boat, capture and load up 2 of every animal, and ride out the storm and subsequent flood on the boat with his family and many, many animals. Now, if you were not forced to go to Bible school as a child, this is the exact same plot as the biblical story of Noah and his very big boat, called an ark. So, maps, yes. The formal name for this Utnapishtim story nowadays is the Sumerian flood myth. It establishes the creation of the world, the hierarchy and alignment of the pantheon of gods, the creation of animals, agriculture, humans, why death exists, the lifespan of humans, and the existence of an island of everlasting life that is outside the regular world. So it's got a lot in it. So there were minor variations as the story passed through various cultures, but for the most part, it stayed relatively the same. There are 3 different versions we have that were all translated from cuneiform. The aforementioned 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh from the 20th century BCE in Sumer, something called the Atrahasis from the 18th century BCE in Akkad, and another one called the Eridu Genesis from the 16th century BCE in Sumer. And then there's the version that we know, the story of Noah's Ark, the 5th century BCE Judean version. So to clarify how intrinsic this story is to Western society, there is a 2014 Darren Aronofsky film starring Russell Crowe, Jennifer Connelly, and Anthony Hopkins called Noah that retells the story of Noah's Ark. So whether it is a metaphor of a rainbow or a dove or an olive branch as a symbol of peace, this story is inescapable in our society. But stories don't exist in the same way outside of the culture that they're told in. Like a movie remade for an American audience, stories also exist as a reflection of the culture that they are created for. But if you are not from that culture, how do you know if you really understand the point of the story? People all around the world are exposed to modern American media through movies, TV shows, and the internet, and through this constant inundation, we assume that people in other countries will understand American culture. As we all know, popular story is not guaranteed to be a well-told story. Some popular stories, in fact, are bad. So, what makes a story bad? Some stories are bad because of sloppy writing, others because of underwhelming characters, and still more because of idiotic plots that make no sense. There can be characters who only do things in order to move the story forward, messed up timelines, and interpersonal relationships that also make no sense. Sometimes, if you're really unlucky, you get all of that in one story. What story could possibly have all these elements and still be one of the most well-known in the modern world? Oh, you thought I was going to say Noah's Ark. Yes, Noah's Ark may be one of the worst stories of all time. And I feel I can make this statement because we have the original story it was based on. Just like 50 Shades of Grey twists Twilight into completely unrecognizable scenarios, Noah's Ark takes its Mesopotamian origins and twists them into Gordian knots. So, Like I mentioned earlier, the Mesopotamian flood story is about explaining the hierarchy of everything in existence, which includes multiple gods. The main episode of conflict between the gods explains the existence of humanity, why we die, why childbirth is so awful, and why humans have to be farmers. This is all resolved in the episode with the flood and the big boat. So, the emphasis in the Mesopotamian versions is on the creation and enforcement of order within the universe. It explains why everything happens the way it does. And then there's the Noah version. So right away, there's a major problem with this variation on the story. How can there be a conflict between gods when there's only one God? In the Mesopotamian story, one god causes the flood and a different god subverts it. But in the Noah story, there's only one figure with enough power to both cause the flood and to stop it, so he must do both actions. This raises the question of why there even needs to be a flood in the first place. An omniscient, singular God could have just had all the unworthy humans drop dead immediately. You know, like with a plague. Ooh, Yul Brynner in the most heterosexual movie of all time. Sex. So we're heading right into 50 Shades of Grey territory because the whole monotheism thing takes the original story and it completely upends the central conflict between the gods. So why bother to include this story in Genesis? I'm glad you asked. We've learned through translations of cuneiform tablets that all of the creation stories included in the book of Genesis, and you should reread it because there are multiple creation stories in the book of Genesis, they are all rewrites of existing well-known myths within the Mesopotamian world, but with only one god. So this singular god has to become the hero and the villain, the creator and the destroyer, the forgiver and the condemnator. And within this framework, many rewrites are possible. But what could the motivation have been for the writers of the Old Testament to create these particular stories? So sometimes motivation can be simple, like with one called the Enuma Elish, which is the story of creation from the 2nd century BCE in Babylon, rediscovered by archaeologists in the Great Library of Ashurbanipal. The Enuma Elish took these well-known myths and replaced every hero god with Marduk in order to celebrate and promulgate the greatness of Marduk. Babylon's star was rising, and therefore so was Marduk's, the city's god. And so we get a version of these creation story that's all about Marduk, king of the gods. It's still polytheistic, but which god is top billing has been shifted from Enlil to Marduk. So that's a rewrite with a clear motivation, and it's not even the first time that the hero god was switched in these stories in order to highlight one god in particular. These retellings changed over time depending on which Mesopotamian culture was dominant and which god they thought was the most important, but the stories themselves didn't fundamentally change. The versions told in the Old Testament did not undergo that simple type of shift in main characters. They underwent a much greater transformation. It's like the Icelandic translation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which of course everyone knows about here. You all know about this, right? The Icelandic author who was commissioned to translate Dracula from English into Icelandic actually rewrote the book to include new characters, added subplots that were not in the original, and the Jonathan Harker character is obsessed with women's bosoms, just to name a few changes. Sex. The Old Testament stories, including the Noah's Ark story, underwent similarly drastic changes. So, retelling these familiar stories with totally different twists highlights how this new religion, this monotheism, was completely different from the extant polytheistic religions. The polytheistic religions emphasize that bad events are caused by conflicts between the gods, and that art and humans are collateral damage. Monotheistic Yahweh worship is very clear that bad events are caused by God punishing someone for bad behavior. Reviewing the Old Testament stories in contrast to the Mesopotamian myth cycle reveals how they were changed to highlight a focus on righteousness, transgression, and wickedness. God created a world that was good, and then humanity ruined it through disobedience, the Garden of Eden story, and violence, Cain and Abel. And then God spends the rest of the 5 books of the Old Testament punishing basically all humans all the time because they are wicked by default. And this concept is actually further embraced in the New Testament by the continuation of the theme that only obedience to God can save humanity from this inherent wickedness. And because of how Christianity spread throughout Europe and became the dominant culture, this obsession with wickedness and transgression and forgiveness was spread throughout the world through colonialism. The discovery of cuneiform and the translation of clay tablets starting in the 1870s has given us a lens to see how the same stories can be told in a different culture without the obsession with wickedness. And who knows what sort of world we could have had created with the Mesopotamian versions instead of the Old Testament versions. What if the default reaction to bad things happening was, must be the gods fighting again, instead of, that's what you deserve for being a bad boy. Sex. Would we all be nihilists, Lebowski? So, I would like to raise my glass to offer both an apology and a dedication. First, an apology to Laura for giving an entire talk on cuneiform without once mentioning Ian Nasser, world's worst copper merchant. And second, a dedication to the dude. Let us all abide.
Believe it or not, we still don't have any pitches in our database about Ia Nasir. Yeah,